The flickering neon sign of Sam's Gas and Go illuminated the barren stretch of highway, its buzz cutting through the stillness of the night. Greg Turner, a college student traveling home for the holidays, pulled into the station, his car running low on gas. It was almost midnight, and the only other light for miles came from the pale moon and a set of distant headlights speeding away in the opposite direction. Greg stepped out, stretching his legs as a cold wind blew across the empty desert. He reached for the gas pump, but the digital screen flashed. Prepay inside. With a sigh, he locked his car and headed toward the dimly lit convenience store. The glass door creaked as he pushed it open, a bell jingling overhead. The interior was eerily quiet. Rows of snacks and drinks lined the walls, but the shelves looked disheveled, as though someone had rummaged through them in a hurry. At the counter stood a man in his late 40s with a wiry frame, his face pale and gaunt. His name tag read, Earl. "Pump 3, Greg said, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. Earl didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes darted toward the window, scanning the parking lot as if expecting someone or something. "You traveling alone?" Earl asked in a gravelly voice, finally breaking the silence. The question felt too pointed, and Greg hesitated before nodding. Earl leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You need to be careful out here, son. Don't stop for anyone, no matter what." Before Greg could ask what he meant, Earl activated the pump and waved him off, his expression clouded with urgency. Feeling unnerved, Greg hurried back to his car. He began filling his tank, glancing nervously around the empty lot. The wind howled louder now, and the shadows cast by the gas station's floodlights seemed to dance unnaturally. As the pump clicked to signal his tank was full, a muffled noise caught his attention. A faint crying sound drifted from the far corner of the station, where the shadows were deepest. He froze, straining his ears. It was unmistakable, a woman's sobs, low and desperate. Greg's first instinct was to ignore it. Earl's warning echoed in his head, but the sound tugged at his conscience. What if someone was in trouble? Against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight from his glove compartment and walked toward the noise. "Hello," he called, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Greg's pulse quickened as he swept the flight across the area. Behind a stack of old tires, a figure moved. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and face streaked with dirt. She looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Help me," she whispered. "He's still out there." Greg crouched beside her, trying to calm her down. "Who? What happened?" Before she could answer, the sound of crunching gravel behind him made Greg spin around. A tall man in a hooded jacket stood at the edge of the shadows, his face obscured. Something metallic glinted in his hand. "Step away from her," the man growled, his voice low and menacing. Greg's blood turned to ice. He glanced back at the woman, who now seemed eerily calm, at her tear-streaked face replaced by a chilling smirk. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said softly. Suddenly, the floodlights of the gas station flickered and went out, plunging the area into darkness. Greg fumbled with his flashlight, its beam now weak and sputtering. The hooded man's heavy footsteps grew louder, but when Greg shined the light toward him, the figure was gone. Panic set in. Greg sprinted back toward his car, but the woman's laughter, low and guttural, followed him. He dove into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. As the headlights illuminated the lot, he saw the woman standing in front of his car, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her lips curled into a sinister grin. "Drive," she mouthed. Greg slammed the gas pedal, swerving around her and speeding back onto the highway. His heart pounded as he checked the rearview mirror. The gas station quickly disappeared into the night, but something was wrong. In the mirror, the woman was sitting in his back seat, her grin wide and unrelenting. Greg's scream echoed down the empty highway, but by the time his car was found the next morning, engine still running, doors locked, he was nowhere to be seen. Only the faint scent of gasoline lingered in the air, and a single smeared handprint on the inside of the rear window. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, bordered by dense woods on either side. It was nearly 2 a.m., and the gas gauge on Mia's car hovered dangerously close to empty. She cursed under her breath as her GPS informed her there wouldn't be another station for 40 miles. That's when she spotted it, a flickering neon sign that read 24-hour fuel and mart. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the isolated gas station. The station looked dilapidated, as if it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The fluorescent lights inside the convenience store buzzed faintly, illuminating dusty shelves and an unmanned counter. The pumps themselves were ancient, the kind you had to prepay for inside. Mia sighed, stepping out into the cold night air. The faint smell of gasoline mixed with damp earth made her stomach turn. As she approached the store, a rustling noise caught her attention. She turned to see a figure in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the parking lot. It looked like someone standing still, too still. "Hello?" she called hesitantly. The figure didn't move. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to look away. It was probably her imagination, or maybe some local who had no interest in her business. Still, her hand trembled as she pushed open the store's glass door. Inside, the air was thick, stale. She rang the bell on the counter, but no one appeared. A faint noise came from the back of the store, footsteps, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" she called again, her voice unsteady. From the doorway behind the counter, a man emerged. He was tall and wiry, his face hidden under the shadow of a baseball cap. His shirt bore no name tag, just a greasy stain near the hem. His eyes, sharp and darting, studied her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "Need something?" he finally asked, his voice low and hoarse. Pump 3, $30, Mia said quickly, sliding cash across the counter. The man didn't immediately take the money. Instead, he glanced out the window toward the pumps, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, almost too quietly for her to hear. "What?" she asked, confused. "Pump your gas and leave. Don't stop for anyone. Don't look back." His tone was clipped, urgent. Before she could ask anything more, he grabbed the cash and disappeared into the back room, the door slamming shut behind him. Mia stood there, heart racing. Something about the man's warning made her skin crawl. She hurried back outside and began fueling her car, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows around her. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange smell. Something metallic like rust or blood. The nozzle clicked, signaling her tank was full. She replaced it hurriedly and jumped into her car, locking the doors. But as she started the engine, she noticed something in her side mirror. The same figure she had seen earlier, closer now, standing at the edge of the lot. She couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a person, unmoving, watching. Panic took over. She put the car in drive and peeled out of the station, her tires squealing on the asphalt. Her eyes darted between the road and her rearview mirror, but the figure didn't follow. Relief began to settle in, until she realized she wasn't alone. A faint scraping noise came from the back seat. Mia froze. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her breathing shallow. Slowly, she glanced at the mirror again. In the dim light, she saw a face, pale, wide-eyed, and grinning, staring back at her from the shadows of the back seat. She screamed, swerving wildly as the figure lunged forward. The car skidded off the road, crashing into a ditch. When Mia opened her eyes, the car was upside down, her body pinned by the seatbelt. Pain shot through her side, but she was alive. The figure was gone. Panting, she fumbled to undo her seatbelt and crawl out of the wreckage. She stumbled onto the road, blood trickling down her forehead. The highway was empty, silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. She turned back to look at her car and froze. The figure was standing on the roof of the overturned vehicle, staring at her. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Why did you stop?" it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. Mia turned and ran, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't stop until a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, belonging to a trucker who pulled over to help her. When she glanced back, the figure was gone. The trucker drove her to the nearest town where she reported the incident to the police. They found her car the next morning, but there was no sign of anyone else. Just a single message scrawled in the dirt on the windshield: "Next time, don't stop." The road was deserted, a long, dark ribbon cutting through a dense forest. Kevin was exhausted, his eyelids heavy as he drove. The clock on his dashboard glowed a soft green, 1:47 a.m. He was still hours from his destination, but the gas gauge hovered just above empty. When a sign appeared in the distance, gas ahead 1 mile, he felt a wave of relief. The station came into view, an old structure surrounded by towering pines. Its single fluorescent bulb flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows on the cracked pavement. A rusty, hand-painted sign above the building read, "Haven Gas." Kevin pulled up to the pump, noting how the place seemed frozen in time, like something out of the 1960s. He stepped out into the cold night air, his breath visible in the glow of the overhead light. The pump was ancient, with faded numbers on its dial and a worn crank handle. A sign taped to it read, "Pay inside first." Kevin sighed, glancing around. There were no other cars, no sign of life, but the windows of the convenience store were lit, and he could make out shelves stocked with goods. As he opened the store door, a bell jingled above him. The inside smelled of mildew and old wood. Behind the counter sat an older man with deep wrinkles and cloudy eyes. His head jerked up as Kevin entered, and for a moment the two just stared at each other. "Pump 2, Kevin said, pulling a $20 bill from his wallet. The old man didn't move. He simply stared at Kevin, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You shouldn't be here," the man finally said, his voice cracked and uneven. Kevin frowned. "Excuse me?" The man leaned forward, his hands gripping the counter. "It's not safe. Not at night." "Look, I just need some gas," Kevin replied, trying to keep his tone steady. The man sighed, shaking his head as though mourning a decision already made. He rang up the sale, handed Kevin his receipt, and then said, almost pleadingly, "Whatever you do, don't look in the mirrors." Kevin's brow furrowed. "What?" But the man was done talking. He sat back in his chair, staring at the counter as if Kevin wasn't even there anymore. Unsettled, Kevin left the store and started pumping his gas. He couldn't shake the old man's words. "Don't look in the mirrors." He glanced at his car, the side mirrors catching faint glints of the flickering station light. A chill ran down his spine, though he couldn't say why. The night felt heavier now, as if the surrounding darkness were pressing closer. As he finished fueling, a noise made him jump, a soft tapping sound coming from the rear of his car. Kevin spun around, but there was nothing there, just the night and the faint rustling of the trees. He got back in the car, locking the doors out of habit. The engine roared to life, and he pulled onto the empty road, eager to put the creepy gas station behind him. The forest closed in around him as he drove, the tall trees leaning in like silent sentinels. He turned on the radio, hoping for some music to cut through the eerie silence, but all he got was static. Frustrated, he turned it off. That's when he noticed it. In the rearview mirror, something moved. Kevin's stomach dropped as he focused on the reflection. For a moment, he thought it was just a trick of the light, shadows from the trees, perhaps. But no, something was there, sitting in the back seat, a figure. Kevin's breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare look back. The old man's warning screamed in his mind. But his eyes stayed glued to the mirror. The figure was tall and gaunt, with long, spindly fingers resting on the seat beside it. Its face was pale, featureless, except for its eyes. Black, endless pits that seemed to pull at his very soul. It smiled. Kevin swerved, nearly driving off the road. He forced his eyes back to the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His chest heaved, every instinct telling him to glance back to confirm it was really there. But he didn't. He pressed the accelerator, the car hurtling down the empty highway. His pulse pounded in his ears, his vision tunneling. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the road a never-ending ribbon of despair. And then he felt it, a cold breath on his neck. Kevin screamed, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Trembling, he forced himself to look at the rearview mirror again. It was gone. For a long moment, Kevin just sat there, gasping for air. The silence was deafening. He turned to look in the back seat, heart hammering in his chest. Empty. Relief washed over him, though his hands still shook as he gripped the wheel. He tried to laugh at himself, convincing himself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the old man's creepy warning. But as he adjusted the mirror to check the road behind him, he froze. There, scrawled across the inside of the rear windshield in smeared dark letters, were 3 chilling words. "Don't look back." Kevin's scream echoed through the night as the car's engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the suffocating darkness. The rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold, as Laura drove through the winding backroads of a rural highway. She was on her way to visit her sister in a small town 100 miles away, but the storm had turned the trip into a slow, nerve-wracking ordeal. Her windshield wipers fought a losing battle, and the faint glow of her car's dashboard was the only source of comfort in the oppressive darkness. Her gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. Laura cursed herself for not filling up earlier, but when a neon sign appeared through the rain, she felt a wave of relief. Miller's Gas and Snacks, it read, the letters blinking sporadically. The gas station sat isolated on the side of the road, its solitary pump glistening under the dim light. The windows of the small convenience store were fogged over, and no other cars were in sight. Laura pulled in, shivering as she stepped out of the car. The cold rain soaked her almost immediately. The pump handle was old and rusted. She tried squeezing it, but nothing happened. A sign taped to the pump read, "Pay inside first." Groaning, Laura hurried to the store, pushing through the heavy glass door. A bell jingled above her head. The inside of the store was silent except for the low hum of a refrigerator in the back. The shelves were sparsely stocked, and everything smelled faintly of mildew. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 50s, her face pale and waxy under the fluorescent lights. She didn't look up as Laura approached. "Pump 2, Laura said, sliding her credit card across the counter. The woman finally lifted her gaze, her expression vacant. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said flatly. Laura blinked. "What?" "It's too late now," the woman muttered, almost to herself. She swiped Laura's card with a shaking hand. "If you see her, don't let her in." A chill ran down Laura's spine. "What are you talking about?" The woman didn't answer. She just pushed the card back toward Laura, her eyes distant and haunted. Uneasy, Laura grabbed her card and left without another word. The rain had intensified, and the wind howled as she returned to the pump. She began fueling her car, her eyes darting around nervously. The woman's warning played over and over in her mind. "If you see her, don't let her in." As the pump clicked, signaling her tank was full, Laura heard it. A soft, muffled voice carried on the wind. She froze, her hands still on the pump. It was faint at first, but growing louder. "Help me." Her heart raced. She turned toward the sound, squinting through the rain. A figure stood at the edge of the station's lot, barely visible in the shadows. It was a woman, drenched and trembling, her long hair plastered to her face. "Please," the woman called, her voice cracking. "I need help." Laura hesitated, the warning echoing in her head. She should get in her car and leave. But what if this woman was really in trouble? "Are you okay?" Laura called, stepping toward her. The woman staggered forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. The rain seemed to cling to her, dripping from her clothes in thick black streaks. Her head tilted, her eyes locking onto Laura's. "Let me in," the woman said, her voice suddenly calm and low. "It's so cold out here." Something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at Laura to get away. She turned back toward her car, fumbling with her keys. "Please don't leave me out here," the woman said, now closer. Too close. Laura yanked the car door open and dove inside, slamming it shut and locking it. The engine roared to life, and she threw the car into reverse, her tires skidding on the wet pavement. As she looked up, her heart stopped. The woman was now standing directly in front of her car, her face illuminated by the headlights. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Laura screamed, slamming the car into drive. The woman didn't move as the car lurched forward, passing straight through her. A bone-chilling laugh filled the air, echoing inside Laura's car. She sped down the highway, her breath ragged. Rain lashed against the windows, but she didn't dare slow down. Every few seconds, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman chasing her. But the road behind her was empty. She began to calm, the warmth of the car seeping into her shaking limbs. She glanced at the passenger seat, wanting to grab her phone to call someone, anyone, and then she froze. Sitting there, dripping wet and grinning, was the woman. Laura's scream was lost in the sound of thunder as the car careened off the road and into the trees. By the time the storm cleared and the wreck was found, Laura was gone. The only clue was a single wet handprint smeared across the inside of the windshield. The sign for Tommy's Gas and Rest Stop loomed out of the darkness, its bright red letters glowing faintly through the thick fog that clung to the isolated highway. Jake was relieved. His truck was running on fumes, and the desolate stretch of road had offered no other signs of civilization for miles. He pulled into the lot, his headlights barely cutting through the dense fog. The gas station was small and run down, the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time. The single pump was old and creaky, and the convenience store's windows glowed faintly from a dim bulb inside. Jake got out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was eerily still, the fog dampening all sound. He grabbed the nozzle and tried to pump gas, but nothing happened. A faded sign taped to the pump read, Prepay inside. With a frustrated sigh, Jake shoved his hands in his pockets and headed for the store. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The interior was sparse, with dusty shelves and a counter cluttered with faded lottery tickets and old candy bars. A man stood behind the counter, his back turned, hunched over as if looking at something on the floor. His shoulders jerked occasionally, as though he were laughing quietly to himself. "Hey," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't respond. Jake cleared his throat. "I need 20 on pump one." The man straightened abruptly, but didn't turn around. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. Jake frowned. "Yeah, well, I need gas. Can you?" The man finally turned, and Jake took a step back. The clerk's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and glassy as though he hadn't slept in years. His lips stretched into a forced, too-wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," the man repeated, almost sing-song as though it were some inside joke Jake wasn't in on. "Look, I just need some gas," Jake said, a hint of irritation in his voice. He pulled a $20 bill from his pocket and slapped it on the counter. "Pump one." The man's smile faltered, his eyes darting toward the windows. "Fill your tank, then leave. Quickly." The urgency in his tone sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Without another word, he turned and hurried back outside. The fog seemed thicker now, swirling in unnatural patterns around the station. He shoved the nozzle into his truck's tank, glancing nervously over his shoulder as the pump ticked. That's when he heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against metal. Jake's heart raced as he scanned the lot, but the fog obscured everything beyond a few feet. The scraping grew louder, closer. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. Silence. The pump clicked, signaling his tank was full. Jake shoved the nozzle back into place and climbed into his truck, locking the doors. He started the engine, the familiar rumble momentarily easing his nerves. As he put the truck in drive, a figure appeared in his headlights. It was a woman, standing perfectly still in the middle of the lot. Her long black hair hung limply over her face, her pale hands clutching the sides of a tattered white dress. Jake's blood ran cold. He couldn't see her face, but something about her stance was wrong, unnatural. She took a step forward. Jake didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas, swerving around her as she reached out toward the truck. His tires screeched on the pavement as he sped back onto the highway, his heart hammering in his chest. The fog seemed to follow him, clinging to the road as his headlights cut through the gloom. He glanced in his rearview mirror and froze. The woman was there, sitting in the bed of his truck. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her dark hair whipping in the wind. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel as he pushed the truck to its limits, speeding faster and faster. But no matter how far he drove, the woman stayed there, unmoving, her presence filling the cab with a suffocating sense of dread. And then she was gone. Jake blinked, his breath catching in his throat. He looked in the mirror again. Nothing. The bed of the truck was empty. Relief washed over him, and he let out a shaky laugh. The laugh died in his throat when he looked at the passenger seat. The woman was there, her face inches from his. Her skin was pale and cracked like porcelain, her eyes black voids that seemed to stretch endlessly. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Jake screamed, swerving violently as the truck skidded off the road and crashed into a ditch. The next morning, a passing driver found Jake's truck overturned and abandoned. The police searched the area but found no trace of him. The gas station clerk, when questioned, had only one thing to say. She found him. She always does. The highway was nearly deserted, save for the occasional flash of headlights in the opposite lane. Samantha gripped the steering wheel tightly, her nerves frayed from hours of driving through the pitch-black night. Her playlist had long since stopped being comforting. Now, even the music felt oppressive, as though it couldn't quite cut through the dense darkness outside. When the low fuel light blinked on, her stomach tightened. She hadn't seen a gas station in miles, and her GPS wasn't picking up any service. Just when she began to panic, a sign loomed out of the shadows. Crossroads Gas, 2 miles ahead. Relieved, Samantha followed the narrow road indicated by the sign. The turnoff led to a small, weathered gas station sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by flat, empty fields. Its lone streetlight flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows across the cracked asphalt. The station itself looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The pumps were ancient, their paint chipped and peeling. Samantha parked next to one, her car's headlights illuminating the peeling sign above the door that read "Open 24 hours." She stepped out into the cold night air, pulling her jacket tight around her. A strange silence hung over the place. No wind, no insects, just an unnatural stillness. She approached the pump, but there was no card reader. A hand-painted sign on the pump read, "Pay inside first." Samantha sighed and headed into the store. The bell above the door jingled weakly, the sound eerily muted. Inside, the shelves were lined with dusty snacks and outdated products. A faint smell of oil and mildew hung in the air. Behind the counter stood a man, his gaunt face partially hidden beneath a trucker cap. "Pump 3, Samantha said, placing a 20 on the counter. The man stared at her for a moment too long, his sunken eyes unblinking. Finally, he nodded and rang up the transaction without a word. As Samantha turned to leave, his gravelly voice stopped her. "Be quick," he said. She paused, looking back at him. "Sorry?" The man's expression didn't change. "Fill up and leave. Don't stick around." His voice was flat, almost mechanical. Samantha frowned but nodded, the unease creeping into her chest. Outside, she began fueling her car, the sound of gas rushing into the tank, strangely loud in the silent night. As the pump ticked, she noticed something moving at the edge of the lot. A figure. It was distant, just a dark silhouette against the faint light of the horizon. Samantha squinted, trying to make it out, but it was too far. The figure began to move closer, slow and deliberate. Samantha felt her pulse quicken. She looked back at the pump. Still not finished. She glanced at the store. The man inside was gone, the counter now empty. The figure came closer, its movements unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Samantha could make out its features now. A woman, her face pale and slack, her eyes wide and staring. She wore a tattered dress that clung to her like it had been soaked in water. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice carrying across the still night air. Samantha's breath hitched. She took a step back, her gaze darting between the woman and her car. "Please," the woman whispered again, her tone pleading. "I need help." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but something stopped her. The woman's movements were wrong. Her feet barely touched the ground, and her head twitched unnaturally with every step. The pump clicked, signaling her tank was full. Samantha ripped the nozzle free and jumped into her car, her hands shaking as she started the engine. She glanced back at the lot. The woman was gone. Samantha's breath came in short gasps as she sped down the road, the headlights carving a path through the darkness. Her rearview mirror reflected only the empty road behind her, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the image of that woman's face. Suddenly, a loud thump reverberated through the car, as though something had struck the roof. Samantha screamed, swerving violently as the car skidded across the road. She hit the brakes, her heart hammering as she came to a stop. Silence. Shaking, Samantha glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time, she wasn't alone. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes fixed on Samantha's. Her mouth opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "Drive," the woman whispered, her voice dripping with malice. Samantha slammed her foot on the gas, the car lurching forward as tears streamed down her face. The woman didn't move, her unblinking eyes burning into Samantha's through the mirror. When Samantha reached the next town, she stumbled out of the car, screaming for help. Bystanders rushed to her, but when they searched the vehicle, it was empty. The local sheriff listened to her story with a grim expression. "You were at Crossroads Gas?" he asked. Samantha nodded, still trembling. The sheriff sighed, removing his hat. "That station burned down 20 years ago. A woman died in the fire. They say she still wanders the lot, looking for someone to take her with them." Samantha's car was found abandoned the next morning, parked at the edge of a field. The engine was still running. She was never seen again. The night stretched on endlessly as Derek drove down the desolate country highway, his playlist droning in the background as his eyes scanned the endless blackness. The clock on his dashboard read 12:13 a.m., and the low fuel warning light had been on for the last 20 miles. He clenched his teeth, anxiety rising as the road remained empty. Finally, a beacon of hope emerged, a glowing sign ahead that read Wayfair Gas and Diner. It was a small, outdated gas station, the kind you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere. Its flickering neon lights cast a sickly yellow glow over the cracked asphalt lot. Derek pulled in, his tires crunching the gravel as he parked beside one of the old pumps. The place was eerily quiet. the only sound the faint hum of the neon sign overhead. Derek tried the pump, but nothing happened. A faded note on the pump read, "Pay inside." He sighed, stuffing his wallet into his back pocket and heading into the store. A bell chimed as he opened the door, the sound strangely dull against the oppressive silence. Inside, the store was dimly lit and sparsely stocked. A man sat behind the counter, his face pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed as if he hadn't slept in days. "Pump 4, Derek said, pulling a $20 bill from his pocket. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at Derek, his lips twitching slightly as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. Finally, he muttered, "You're better off leaving while you can." Derek raised an eyebrow. "What?" The man's gaze darted to the clock on the wall. "It's late. Bad things happen out here at night." Derek forced a laugh, trying to mask his discomfort. "Yeah, well, I'm running on fumes. I need gas." The man hesitated, then took the bill and rang it up. As he handed Derek his receipt, his hand lingered, his grip firm, his eyes locked with Derek's. "If you see someone out there, don't stop, no matter what." Derek frowned, his unease deepening. "What are you talking about?" The man let go, leaning back into the shadows. "You'll understand soon enough." Shaking his head, Derek turned and left, the bell chiming again as the door shut behind him. He stepped out into the night, the air colder now, almost biting. The pump worked this time, and as he filled his tank, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes scanned the lot, the surrounding darkness pressing in like a living thing. The shadows beyond the station seemed deeper than they should have been, shifting unnaturally. That's when he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. It was tall and thin, its outline barely discernible against the dark. "Hello?" Derek called, his voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. His heart thudded in his chest as he quickly replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his car. He started the engine and pulled onto the road, glancing nervously into his rearview mirror. The figure was gone. The highway stretched out before him, empty and endless. The tension in his chest began to ease, and he tried to laugh at himself. Just a trick of the light, he thought. Probably a shadow. But then, his headlights caught something up ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the road, waving its arms. Derek's stomach clenched as he slowed the car. It was a woman, her hair wild and tangled, her clothes dirty and torn. She looked frantic, her eyes wide and desperate. "Help me," she screamed, her voice piercing the night. Derek's hands tightened on the wheel as the clerk's words echoed in his mind. "Don't stop, no matter what." The woman stepped closer, her hands slamming onto the hood of his car. "Please, you have to help me," she sobbed, her face twisted with fear. Derek hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake. She looked real. She looked terrified, but something about her felt off. Her head tilted unnaturally, her sobbing stopping abruptly. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. Her pupils were black, endless voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Her mouth curled into a wide, unnatural smile, revealing jagged, too sharp teeth. Derek slammed his foot on the gas, the car lurching forward. The woman's body disappeared into the shadows as he sped down the road, his heart pounding in his chest. But he wasn't alone. In the rearview mirror, he saw her again. Sitting in the back seat, her head tilted, her grin stretching impossibly wide. Derek's screams filled the car as the steering wheel jerked on its own, the car veering off the road. It flipped, metal crunching as it rolled into the ditch. When the wreck was found the next morning, the car was empty. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of Derek. But every now and then, drivers on that stretch of highway report seeing a frantic woman waving them down in the dead of night. Those who stop are never seen again. It was past midnight when Emma pulled into the gas station. Her road trip had stretched far longer than anticipated, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her. The station sat on the edge of a dense forest, its single flickering light casting long shadows across the empty lot. The place looked old and forgotten, but her gas gauge was perilously close to empty, and she didn't have a choice. Emma stepped out of her car, shivering in the cold night air. The station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. She approached the pump and frowned. The display was blank and the nozzle was cracked. A faded note taped to the side read, "Pay inside first." The building's windows were smeared with grime, and the open sign buzzed faintly. Emma hesitated but forced herself toward the entrance. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the bell above jingling weakly. Inside, the store was dimly lit and sparsely stocked. Rows of dusty shelves lined the walls, and a faint, unpleasant odor hung in the air. Behind the counter sat a man, his face mostly hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap, his shoulders hunched as though he were trying to disappear into himself. "Pump 2, Emma said, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. The man didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he looked up at her. His eyes were bloodshot and deeply sunken, his skin pale and waxy. He studied her for a moment, and then, without a word, he took the money. "You should hurry," he murmured. Emma frowned. "Excuse me?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window behind her, his jaw tightening. "Don't. Linger," he muttered, almost inaudibly. Unease prickled at the back of Emma's neck. She nodded stiffly and stepped back outside. The pump, ancient and rusty, sputtered as it dispensed fuel. The night felt colder now, the air heavier. As the gas flowed, Emma scanned the area. The forest loomed just beyond the edge of the station's light, its shadows deep and impenetrable. She squinted into the darkness, her heart skipping a beat when she thought she saw movement among the trees. The pump clicked off, signaling the tank was full. Emma replaced the nozzle and hurried to her car, her pulse quickening. Just as she reached for the door, a sound stopped her cold. Footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the forest. Emma froze, straining her ears. The sound stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no reply. Slowly, Emma turned back toward the woods. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was tall and impossibly thin, its arms unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. It didn't move, but Emma could feel its gaze locked onto her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as though it were unused to walking. Emma stumbled back, fumbling with her car keys. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The figure stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and oppressive. Then a chilling voice cut through the air. "You can't leave." The words echoed unnaturally, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emma's heart pounded as she yanked open her car door and threw herself inside. She locked the doors, her shaking hands fumbling to start the engine. The figure was gone. Her headlights illuminated only the empty lot as she peeled out of the station. The forest blurred past her as she sped down the highway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. She didn't need to. The figure was sitting in her back seat. Its long arms stretched out, like its skeletal fingers brushing her shoulders as it leaned forward, its face inches from hers. Emma screamed as the car swerved, the steering wheel slipping from her grasp. The car veered off the road, crashing into the trees. When authorities found the wreckage the next day, Emma's car was empty. The gas station attendant, when questioned, only shook his head. "She saw it," he said grimly. "They always come for the ones who see." Now, travelers report strange sightings near the gas station, shadows that move in the corner of your eye, whispers that come from the trees. And if you stop there after midnight, they say you might not leave at all. It was a little after 2 a.m. when Kyle spotted the gas station. His car was running dangerously low, and he'd been driving through rural backroads for hours, trying to get home before dawn. The glowing sign was a welcome relief. "Hunter's Gas and Goods," it read, flickering slightly against the dark. The station sat on the edge of a sprawling cornfield. Its lone pump looked old and weathered, with a payphone booth standing crookedly nearby. The entire scene had an eerie stillness about it, as if time had forgotten this place. Kyle shrugged off the unease. He needed gas, and this was his only option. Pulling up to the pump, he glanced toward the store. The windows were dark, and the inside looked deserted. A small handwritten note taped to the pump read, "Prepay inside." He sighed, grabbed his wallet, and made his way toward the building. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The store smelled faintly of mildew and gasoline, its shelves sparsely stocked with dusty snacks and faded bottles. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face pale and sallow, his eyes hollow and distant. "Pump one," Kyle said, holding out a $20 bill. The old man didn't move at first. He simply stared at Kyle, unblinking, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he reached out with trembling hands, took the money, and rung it up. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be out here this late." Kyle forced a smile, trying to brush off the unease that crept up his spine. "Yeah, well, I'll be out of your hair soon." The old man's eyes flicked toward the window, and his expression tightened. "Get your gas and leave. Fast." Kyle frowned, but the urgency in the man's tone made him nod. He turned and walked back outside, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets to ward off the cold. As he stepped back toward his car, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He froze. Something was moving in the cornfield. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling, like the wind brushing through the stalks. But the air was perfectly still. No wind. Kyle squinted, peering into the dark expanse of corn. A shadow shifted within the rows, taller than the stalks themselves, and it moved with an unnatural smoothness. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he quickly turned back to the pump. The nozzle clicked into place, and he gripped it tightly, his eyes darting toward the cornfield. The shadow emerged from the stalks, stepping into the faint light of the station. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was unnaturally tall and gaunt, his limbs too long for his body. His face was featureless, just smooth, pale skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. He stood motionless, facing Kyle, though there were no eyes to see. Kyle's hands shook as he tried to keep pumping. "Just ignore it," he told himself. "Get your gas and go." The figure tilted its head as though studying him. Then it began to move. Its strides were slow and deliberate, its feet silent against the gravel. It crossed the lot toward him, closing the distance with terrifying ease. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Kyle yanked the nozzle out and fumbled with the cap, his hands trembling as he tried to secure it. The figure was closer now, just a few yards away. It didn't run, didn't lunge, just kept walking, its head tilted unnaturally, its faceless gaze fixed on him. Kyle dove into his car, locking the doors and starting the engine in one frantic motion. He glanced in the rearview mirror and screamed. The figure was now standing directly behind the car, its impossibly long fingers dragging along the trunk. The sound of nails on metal filled the cab as Kyle slammed the car into gear and sped away, gravel spraying behind him. The road stretched out ahead, dark and endless, but the feeling of dread didn't leave. He kept glancing in the mirror, expecting to see the figure chasing him. It didn't. Instead, the darkness seemed to grow thicker. The shadows on the edges of the road twisting and writhing as though alive. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The figure was running alongside his car, keeping pace with impossible speed. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural motions, and its head twisted toward him, a faint hum filling the air as it moved closer. Kyle floored the gas, the speedometer climbing higher and higher as his heart pounded in his chest. The figure kept pace, its inhuman limbs carrying it effortlessly beside him. "Leave me alone," Kyle shouted, tears streaming down his face. The hum grew louder, a low, bone-chilling vibration that seemed to reverberate through the car. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The road ahead was empty, the shadows still once more. Kyle didn't stop until he reached the next town. When he finally pulled into a brightly lit parking lot, he collapsed against the steering wheel, his body trembling with adrenaline. The next morning, he decided to report the incident. But when he described the gas station, the clerk at the diner he was in gave him a puzzled look. "There's no station out there," she said. "Hunter's gas burned down years ago. Whole place went up in flames. They never rebuilt it." Kyle insisted, but the clerk shook her head. "Maybe you saw something else. But if you stopped there..." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're lucky you got away." Kyle didn't argue. He didn't want to think about what would have happened if he hadn't. The rain poured down in thick sheets, hammering against the windshield as Claire strained to see the road ahead. She'd been driving for hours, her GPS no longer working, and the winding back roads were quickly turning into an endless maze. When her fuel light blinked on, her stomach twisted with anxiety. Finally, she spotted a dim glow through the rain. A gas station appeared on the side of the road, its lone pump illuminated by a weak, flickering bulb. Claire sighed in relief and pulled in, her tires splashing through puddles as she parked beside the pump. The building itself was small and dilapidated, the words "Serval Gas" barely visible on its faded sign. Claire stepped out into the rain, pulling her jacket tight as the cold water soaked through her shoes. She grabbed the pump handle, only to realize it wasn't working. A weathered sign on the pump read, "Pay inside first." Cursing under her breath, she jogged to the station. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, a bell chiming overhead. The inside was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent light casting strange shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. Shelves lined the walls, but most were empty, save for a few dusty bags of chips and faded candy wrappers. A man stood behind the counter, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes staring blankly at nothing. His clothes were disheveled, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned on the counter. "Pump 1, Claire said, holding out a $20 bill. The man didn't respond. He just stared at her, unblinking. The longer he looked, the more uneasy she felt. Finally, he took the money, his fingers cold and clammy as they brushed against hers. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Claire frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man's gaze darted toward the window, his expression darkening. "It comes when the rain does." "What does?" Claire asked, but the man shook his head, refusing to answer. Unnerved, Claire hurried back to her car. The rain had intensified, the wind howling as it pushed against her. She grabbed the nozzle and started pumping gas, the sound of fuel rushing into her tank barely audible over the storm. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere nearby. Claire paused, her eyes scanning the rain-soaked lot. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the roof of the station. Her pulse quickened as she craned her neck, trying to see through the downpour. A shadow shifted above her, barely visible in the dim light. It moved quickly, skittering across the roof like a spider, its limbs long and spindly. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tapping sound grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was up there was circling her. Come on," she whispered, willing the pump to fill faster. She dared another glance upward and saw a flash of movement, a pale, elongated arm reaching over the edge of the roof, its fingers clawing at the air. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Claire yanked the nozzle free, her hands shaking as she fumbled to replace it. Just as she turned to get into her car, something landed on the hood with a deafening thud. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were far too long, its body impossibly thin. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over visible bones. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, dark, empty voids, locked onto hers. Claire screamed, diving into her car and slamming the door shut. The creature slammed its hands against the windshield, its long, clawed fingers scratching at the glass. It let out a sound, a high-pitched, inhuman screech that made her ears ring. She turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. The creature crawled onto the roof, its claws scraping as it moved. Claire floored the gas, the tires spinning before the car lurched forward. The creature clung to the roof, its claws punching through the metal as it tried to tear its way inside. Claire swerved violently, trying to shake it off, but it held fast. The screeching sound of its claws on the car's frame was deafening. Desperate, Claire spotted a bridge up ahead. The water below was swollen and raging from the storm. She veered toward it, her heart pounding as she accelerated. At the last second, she slammed on the brakes, sending the creature flying forward. It hit the guardrail and tumbled into the river below, disappearing into the churning water. For a moment, Claire sat in her car, gasping for breath, the rain pounding against the windows. The road ahead was empty, and the only sound was the storm. But as she looked in the rearview mirror, her blood ran cold. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, its head cocked at that unnatural angle, its void-like eyes fixed on her. It raised one clawed hand, pointing directly at her. Claire didn't wait to see what it would do next. She floored the gas, speeding away into the night. She never stopped at another gas station after midnight again.